Hello, good morning, and welcome to Idea to IPO, how international startups can move to Silicon Valley. My name is Roger Royce. I am your host, your speaker, your moderator today, along with Gabor Skesi, who is a counsel at Haynes & Boone. I'm a partner with Haynes & Boone, an international AmLaw 100 law firm, and Gabor and I are based in Palo Alto, California, heart of Silicon Valley. It is 9 a.m. on Tuesday, August 10th today, and we are doing this remotely throughout the world. So we've got people tuning in from all over the world. For those of you who don't know, ID to IPO is one of the most successful startup meetups in the world with branches all over the world. And we do these events regularly. Sometimes we do venture capital panels, sometimes we do substantive panels. Today we're going to do a substantive panel. We're going to give you some very good targeted substantive information on how you can do business here in Silicon Valley. I want to let you know that this is being recorded. You should also know that we've got slides. We've got plenty of slides. And I'm going to share my slides with everybody here by email after this recording, everyone who's signed up. Also, I am going to send you a digital copy of my last book, Dead on Arrival, How to Avoid the Legal Mistakes That Could Kill Your Startup. So, you know, I've got another book coming out. It'll be out this year called 10,000 Startups. It's a flip side. It's call it a sequel to the first book. And that book will describe more about success strategies. The first book is things not to do. The second book is things that you should do. Yes, this is being recorded. And yes, the recording will be available. I will send you a link. You can go to my YouTube channel and watch the recording at your leisure over and over again and again. Invite all your friends. It will be action-packed. So the way we do things here is we do a 1-hour presentation. Gabor and I will present for an hour, and then we'll do a half hour of Q&A. So what you should do is you should save up your questions and type them in the Q&A box. Use the chat box to chat with people. Consider this a live event, and if you want to talk to somebody across the room, you can use the chat box. Or if you want to tell all of us who you are, use the chat box. And in fact, I think I'm going to start. I'm going to let you know where you can find me by entering into the chat box my LinkedIn information. I like to contact people by LinkedIn, as well as some other information. Here's how you can get a hold of me. And I'm going to put my YouTube channel up in a minute as well while we get going. So feel free to chat me your LinkedIn or your other information or anything else you want to tell me about. Now, before we get going, I would like to know who is in the audience. So I am launching a poll. So tell me who you are. Are you a startup entrepreneur? Are you a more established company? Are you an investor? Are you a service provider? Are you in academia, professor or a student, government or press or media? And right now, it looks like we've got about 60% startup entrepreneurs. We've got a lot of students today. It's interesting. We've got a handful of service providers. Wow, we even have investors. Okay, awesome. We're 40 seconds in, and we're about 60% startups. We have a few more larger companies, but mostly entrepreneurs. That's interesting. It's about 60% entrepreneurs and 6 to 8% of almost everything else except media. There are no members of the press here today. How about that? All right, let's try another poll. Because I would also like to know, where are you from? Because we're doing this at 9 a.m. Pacific, and we scatter these throughout the day, 9 a.m., noon, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock, so we can make it convenient for people in other time zones. So I'm a little curious, who wants to get up at 9 a.m. to listen to me and Gabor talk about international startups? Mostly, wow, look at that. For the first time ever, we have more people from Asia here than we have from Silicon Valley. We still have more people from North America. It's about 18% Silicon Valley, 16% other North America, 30% Asia, 31%, 33% Asia. Look at that. Okay, well, that's good to know. That will inform some of what we talk about. Western Europe, 17%. Usually we do these things at night, and it's hard to get a crowd from Europe, from Western Europe. We have some from Eastern Europe and Russia as well. A few folks from Latin and South America. Nobody from the South Pacific. And we usually get folks from Africa as well. Africa is just booming in startup land. Okay, well, that's it. We've got about 35% North America, including Silicon Valley, 33% Asia, 17% Western Europe, and then 7% Latin and South America. All righty then. Okay, want you to know that you can tweet to hashtag idea to IPO. Feel free to do that throughout. Again, put your questions in the Q&A. So I am now going to go to the technical portion of the presentation, and I am going to share my screen. If you do not see my screen, and even if you do, you should send me a chat to make sure it's all working. All right, am I the only one seeing a black screen? Can you all see the screen? Some people are having trouble with the screen. If you have a black screen, okay, it's probably on your end. So here we go. How international startups can move to Silicon Valley. So just to let you know who I am, as I said, Roger Royce. I am a corporate and tax partner in the Emerging Growth and Venture Capital Group with Haynes & Boone International AmLaw 100 law firm. I am based in Palo Alto, California, and a big part of my practice is companies from outside the US coming into Silicon Valley, coming into California, and coming into the United States generally. And I will tell you why in a minute here, but probably half the companies I work with. I mean, I do almost all technology startups, but a startup, there's a lot of folks in China here. I've had startups that have had $1 billion worth of value in China before they even start up in the US. So I define startup very broadly. It's anybody that's doing, anybody who's doing business in the US for the first time. So why Silicon Valley? Why are we having this presentation, and why is it so popular? So I want you to know that the Silicon Valley is headquarters to some of the top tech companies in the world. The last time I checked, between San Jose and San Francisco, we saw, I counted probably $6 trillion worth of value in that area in terms of market cap. The biggest companies in the world do business here. So there's big market here. There's a big market. People come here for the market. Secondly, people come here for the money. It's home to, yeah, you can see this slide's already out of date. It's bigger than 100 billion. It's more like 130 billion now. A big venture capital industry, and much of that is centered right here in Silicon Valley. Now, granted, it's getting more dispersed because of COVID and Zoom, etc. But for the most part, this is the center of the universe when it comes to startup and technology. And then finally, people come here for talent. People come here to find people to work in our companies. And we are surrounded by great universities, Stanford, Berkeley, several universities in San Francisco, Santa Clara, San Jose. So there's a lot of talent here. There's a lot of talent, and that launches a lot of companies. So certainly there are a lot of reasons to be here. And I like to tell people that when I get up in the morning and drive to work, back when I used to actually drive to my office, you know, when we go back into our office and not work remotely, I drive past some of the biggest companies in the world. I drive past, you know, within a few miles of where I live and where I work, I can drive past Google, LinkedIn, Apple, Microsoft, Intel, Adobe, Acrobat. So some of the biggest companies in the world are here. Within a few miles of where I am right now is probably a quarter to half of all the venture capital in the country that gets invested right along Sand Hill Road. And within, I can see the campus of Stanford from where I am, where a lot of great startups come out of, as well as a lot of other universities in this area. So this really is, in a sense, the center of the universe for technology startups. Now, the first thing I guess I'd like to let you know, and we're going to get into some technical stuff in a minute, but I want to tee this up for you a little bit better because most of you folks are not from here. And the first thing I'd like to let you know is that when I say Silicon Valley, because I've had people, get a little confused about that definition, but when I say Silicon Valley, I mean that area between San Francisco and San Jose. And that's what I mean. And people will argue with me sometimes about whether San Francisco is in Silicon Valley or not, since a lot of the tech startups have moved up there. A lot of them moved out over the last year as well, but they're coming back according to the New York Times. So when I say Silicon Valley, that's what I mean. And I think it's important. It's not a legal issue, and it may go without saying, but it's important to look at a map before you come here. Because I have had people lease space out in Pleasanton or Livermore thinking they were in Silicon Valley. And then they got here and they realized that it was about a 2-hour drive to get here in traffic if they want to take that median on Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park. So this is what I mean by Silicon Valley. All right, so let's jump into it. What we're going to talk about today, doing business here, we're going to touch on a handful of things: corporate, employment, tax, liability, privacy, regulatory, and intellectual property. Those are the main legal issues I want to hit on. And of course, we're just going to skim the surface of what you need to know about, but also I'd like people to know about the general non-legal considerations that they also have to think about. And I'm going to post in the chat a website of mine called Total Startup Solution that gives you some direction on where to find resources for all of these non-legal services that you need along with the legal. But for now, here's a summary of them. So before we do that, I'm going to give you some good practical advice here from somebody who has actually come here from Silicon Valley, and that is Gabor Skesi. He's counsel at Haynes & Boone in our office in Palo Alto, and he's going to take you through some of the issues for startup companies moving here. Gabor, you want to go ahead and open your video and share your screen? And also unmute yourself.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yep, we sure can.
Can you see my slides? Let's see if it works. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gabor Szécsi. I'm working for Haynes & Boone as a capital market and securities attorney here in Palo Alto. I represent startups, small companies, and investors. Before I joined Haynes & Boone, I worked in Europe, Israel, and Australia. I have assisted many startups to move to another country. And in this short presentation, I'm going to share my personal experience. I'm going to talk about some aspects of law in general. I'm not here to give you legal advice. Each of you has different situations, so the law might be different as it is applied to your case. So without further ado, first I would like to take a few minutes to talk about the challenges to start a new business in the United States, or as a matter of fact, in a foreign country, as a foreign entrepreneur. A foreign country is a foreign business environment. The social values are different. People are interacting with each other differently, and it has a huge impact on the ecosystem. There are many ways to describe the ecosystem. I like to use this triangle: society, business, and law. each element has a huge impact on each other. The society defines businesses. People in the society have different values. They have different ways to select products. They have different problems that needs to be solved by businesses. Also, businesses are shaping the society. Amazon, for example, changed the way we are shopping. Social media platforms change the way we advertise, we communicate with each other. And the law roots deeply in the history of the society. For example, in the US, the American constitutional development determined by the political power game between small states and big states, the relationship with the United Kingdom, and the French legal philosophers' influence on the founding fathers made the country's legal system as what it is today. But why is it important? It is important because if you don't understand the legal system, you don't understand how the law works. If you just think about it, in your home country, you learn about law, you learn about doing business from the first day of your life. You see your parents concluding contracts, take out loan, mortgages, buying a house, buying a car, and so on. And as you grow up, you also start doing business, learn about law, learn about interacting with people and living in the society. However, these skills, these acquired basic legal and business skills are not working in another country. When you are doing business, consciously, unconsciously using your basic skills, but in another country, doesn't necessarily work. For example, a few years ago, it's a little bit unrelated story, but illustrates my point very well. A Hungarian lady immigrated to the United States. She was driving her car on a freeway and got pulled over. And in Hungary, when you get pulled over, you get out of the car, show your registration, driver license, talk to the police, get your ticket, and drive away. But here, you remain in your car, grab your wheel, showing your hand, and wait for the police officer's instruction. She didn't know it. She acted as she would in Hungary, got out of the car. The police officers didn't know how to deal with this situation. And the woman almost got shot. And eventually she ended up in jail just because she didn't know these nuance differences between two cultures and didn't know the processes, the protocols, what we have to do here in this country. And if you are doing business in another country, you have similar problems with other authorities. You have to deal with tax authorities. You have to deal with the state and federal authorities. And there are different procedures, processes that you need to learn and that you need to practice to succeed with them. Apart from this, your personal network is missing. When you are starting a business in your country, you naturally relying on your personal network. You have elementary school friends, you have high school friends, you have university friends who are now might be a successful business entrepreneur, business executives, government officials, or professional service providers. And when you are doing business, they are the first people, the first group you can reach out for help if you need advice to apply for a government grant, you need legal advice, or you want to get invitation to events to find professional, you find partners or find your first customers. When you come to another country, it's all missing. You have to build up from scratch. Also, the law in every country is designed for its citizens. What does it mean? It means that the law assumes that you have some basic qualifications, you have a basic informations, like you can present social security number if it is needed, and if you don't, then you have to find another way to solve your problem. Or if you are new in this country, you don't have credit history, and if you need to present credit history, you need to find a way to solve your problem in another way. So as a foreign entrepreneur, not just the new culture, but your different situation makes it more challenging to start your business in a new country. And what you can do, you can talk to other foreign entrepreneurs who have been there, who have done this. You can find professional service providers who have successfully helped foreign companies to relocate to the US, and they can help to solve your special problems. So how to overcome these challenges? You need to learn about the country. You need to learn about the history, the culture, the values. You need to learn about regional cultures. Different parts of the United States have very different cultures. You can start building your network from home. That's probably the most cost efficient way to start your business. Nowadays, using Zoom, other communication apps, devices, you can reach out a lot of people. You can get law firms, you can get in touch with CPAs, CPA firms, and regional business development councils. Regional business development councils usually have very valuable resources. They are offering great resources to relocating companies. Nowadays, we see a fierce competition between states, between different regions for companies. Every region wants to entice companies to create jobs and develop their local economy. For this reason, they are offering great events for relocating startups. They have a list of professional service providers. They can introduce you to potential partners, potential customers. And many times they have financial incentives if you choose the region. Truth to be told, these financial incentives usually available for more established companies. They have strict requirements. They require you to hire people immediately. They want you to make a certain amount of immediate investment, and if you can do it, then they would support you. However, also we can see that because of the competition between different regions, many of them have started to open their financial resources to startups, and you can find regional business development councils who can actually give you financial incentives if you relocate your companies there. Here in California, I personally know the Greater Sacramento Economic Councils, as I think they are looking for more established companies. The Central California Economic Development Corporation likes to see more agricultural related companies. There is a very good one in the Houston area, in Texas, but you can find regional development councils all over the US. The foreign mission of your home country is also a good way to start develop your network in the country. Many of foreign missions have trade chambers, trade associations, and most of them now have especially startup related programs, and some of them have co-working space and similarly to regional business development councils, great resources to help you. You need to review your business plan, marketing plan, see if your marketing plan works in a new society. If you have the same target audience, and the same target audience have the same challenges in the other country, maybe the distribution channel should be changed a little bit because of the different buying customs. And also you need to create a budget for relocation. It's not easy and not cheap to relocate your company to a new country. Immigration, in my opinion, is one of the greatest challenge. There is a reason I put immigration on a separate slide. Immigration falls into two big categories: family-based immigration and non-family-based immigration. If you can come here based on family relationship, probably your situation is much easier. If you don't have family, then the non-family track is what you have. Visas fall into two categories: non-immigrant visas and immigrant visas. The first time when you come here, usually you can get some non-immigrant visas, but you need to keep in mind non-immigrant visas have two types. Some of them provide pathway to citizenship, some of them are not. And if you have a visa that doesn't provide you pathway to citizenship, then you won't be able to get a green card. You won't be able to stay in the country. Non-immigrant visas allows you to stay here for a certain period of time, and you are supposed to leave the country. So you need to, I suggest you should talk to an immigration attorney, like you have to talk to a business, a startup lawyer, a CPA when you are moving your business, and also an immigration attorney, and make an immigration strategy. You need to plan sometimes 3-5 years ahead, because some of the visas available for you that are available for you, it's difficult to get, and you need strategically work for these visas. For example, the L visa, one of the most popular for startups. It's very complicated, a visa type. There is a subcategory that offers you pathway to citizenship, and there is a subcategory that wouldn't allow you to immigrate into the US. So again, you need to talk to an immigration lawyer to find out how it works. In general, you need to be employed 2 years outside the US in the last 3 years to be eligible as an intercompany transferee. You also need to provide a solid business plan. You need a future financial projection and a lot more other information about your company. That's why it's a good example for a visa category that require a long-term preparation, because you need to be employed, and many of you in a foreign country are working for the companies without being formally employed. And if you cannot show employment, you won't be able to get this visa. In my experience, many immigration problem comes when you are rushing your applications. When you get funded and you want to move to the US, and you need some visa immediately, and then you are trying to apply for a visa like L visa, and you get denied because your company is simply not structured in a way that that complies with the L visa requirement. So the bottom line is that you need to make an immigration strategy. You have to make your immigration strategy part of your business plan, and make a clear path to citizenship if you want to immigrate into this country. Another big issue is where should you go? Where should you move your business? The United States is a big country, very diverse. Living expenses, hiring expenses could be very different. For example, if you want to hire a lot of people, if you want to set up a manufacturing facility, California might be too expensive for you. Probably you can find a better location for your company. But if you are a technology startup, you probably want to be in a proximity of a big startup hub like Silicon Valley. Therefore, the geographical location of your place of business largely depends on the scope of your business and maybe the local incentives, what you can get from the region, what I have just told you. Where to establish your company? Delaware is one of the most important jurisdictions in the United States. However, you can see a lot of advertisements: set up your company in Wyoming or Texas or Florida or in other states. But at the end of the day, I would say that the big question is that if you go to Delaware or you set up your company in a state where you are doing business. This is because where you are doing business, you must register your company to be able to legally do business. And if you register your company in Wyoming, for example, but you are doing business in California, you end up registering your company in Wyoming as well as in California. And you have to comply with both states' jurisdiction. You are going to pay tax in California, and eventually you are going to lose the incentives what the other state offers. That's why if you don't have a special reason to register your company in a state, you don't have to. Delaware has a special situation in the US because the state offers some tax benefits. Delaware doesn't impose income tax on corporation registered in the state, as long as they are doing business out of the state, out of Delaware. It doesn't mean that you don't have to pay tax in Delaware. There is something called franchise tax. You have to pay, have to file an annual report and pay franchise tax based on the share value. And if the share value increases, you have to pay a higher franchise tax. Franchise tax is somewhere between a few $100s to thousands of dollars. I think the maximum amount nowadays is $200,000. So you have some obligations in Delaware, but if you are trying to raise money, for example, from venture capitals, the venture capital community prefers Delaware. Probably you need a Delaware corporation, and if your place of business is in California, then you have to register your Delaware company in California as well. So in most cases, the company registration depends on your needs, your special situation, and you need to structure your business carefully. You can save some money on legal compliance and and on taxes, of course. Okay, that's about it. That's all I wanted to say today. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach me out. I'm happy to learn more about your business. Roger is going to talk more about relocating your business. He also has a lot more useful information. Roger, please take it away. Thank you again.
All right, so thank you, Gabor. Thanks for that perspective. I'm going to pick it back up where I left it with some and get kind of drill down into some more technical topics for those of you who are interested in moving here to Silicon Valley or establishing a company here. And so usually the scenario that I see when a company wants to come into this market, California or the US generally, it's usually a company that has already established themselves someplace else and proven their product. They've proven the concept. They've maybe gotten a little traction in their home country, and now they're coming into the US market. And the question is, how do we approach that market? So the first decision you'll have to make is whether you're going to enter as a US branch or whether you're going to form that US corporation that Gabor was talking about. And keep in mind, a US corporation is a separate juridical entity. It's a separate tax-paying entity. It's a separate entity for liability purposes. It acts as a shield for both US tax and US liabilities for the foreign parent company. So almost always, the non-US company will not just open an office here and operate as a branch. Almost always will form a US corporation. As Gabor said, oftentimes it's Delaware, and that's a fact-specific question. My rule of thumb is that if the company is going to do business in more than one state, I will use Delaware because they're for a number of reasons, one of which is their Secretary of State's office is relatively easy to deal with. If the company is only going to do business here in California, for example, then we may as well have a California corporation and just deal with it. But there's bigger reasons than just the administrative. The bigger reason here is that if the non-US entity doesn't form a US company, it just operates as a branch, well, it's got unlimited liability for anything that branch might incur. That could be employment-related liabilities. That could be what we call tort liability. Somebody slips and falls, a harassment claim. But mostly what's on people's mind are tax liabilities, especially if you're in a high tax state like California. Putting a US company in between shields the foreign company from tax. Now, the US company has to pay that tax, but the foreign company itself is not in the system. It's not providing information to our Internal Revenue Service. It's not having to share its worldwide operations with federal and state authorities. So like I say, almost always, the foreign company will 99.9% of the time will enter this market through a corporation. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Gabor talked a little bit about where to incorporate, and I had already mentioned that. By the way, I'm also licensed in Nevada. Nevada used to be a real darling for companies coming into the US. If you're doing business in Nevada, it still is, but it's relatively complicated in Nevada these days. I want to jump ahead a little bit and talk a little bit more about you, the company that wants to come into the US. Now, let's suppose you're a company that came here to Silicon Valley, not only for markets and for talent, but also you're thinking you might attract investors here. Because remember what I said, $130 billion venture business this year, much of it here in the Valley. Well, what you're going to soon find out is that most VCs, not all, and this is a generalization, and generalizations are risky, but this one I feel pretty good about. Most venture capitalists, they want to invest, like Gabor said, in a Delaware corporation. Well, they want that Delaware corporation to own everything they're investing in. So let's think about that structure we just set up. Foreign company owns 100% of US company. maybe it's a Delaware corporation. The investor does not want to invest in a subsidiary. They want to invest in a company that owns the intellectual property, that employs people, that has the contracts, that has the revenues. They want the parent company, not the sub, but they want that parent company to be a Delaware corporation. So we will end up doing oftentimes what we call an inbound flip transaction. Now, in its simplest form, what that means is the shareholders of the foreign company transfer their shares in that foreign company into this new US Delaware company in exchange for stock of the Delaware company. So when the smoke clears, the shareholders now own stock in a Delaware corporation, which owns stock in the former foreign company. The investor invests in the Delaware corporation and indirectly has a piece of everything in that business. Very common, we do that all the time. As a US matter, that's relatively simple. As a tax matter, usually it's not a problem. There are some wrinkles, as you can imagine, in tax. You do need tax advice. If there are US shareholders of that foreign company, and if there are too many of them, you might end up with some tax analysis that has to be done. But usually we can do this as a tax-free transaction as a US matter. Usually it's not that way on the foreign side. So this is a mixed issue. We have to understand if we're going to have foreign tax implications. The other issue you might have is if you have investors, especially government investors. Some countries, Singapore comes to mind, you'll find government investors or government-backed funds that will be owning stock in the foreign company. That might be a restriction on this structure. So there's lots to think about, but that's the basic idea. Now, if for some reason we can't do the flip because of that, we've got ways around that. There's the concept of stapled entities or parallel entities, where you buy stock in the foreign company, you automatically get stock in the US company. I've done that transaction in Canada many times. It's very common. So just something to know about. And why would you do that? You're doing that to prepare for US investors. So just be very careful here. What do your US investors want? And that's usually the first question you're going to ask, even before you do the flip. You know, do you want US investors? Then you'll do the flip into the US. If you're going to have foreign investors, you would not do that, because the flip just subjects your entire company now to US taxation. So it's an expensive thing to do as a tax matter, and you don't do it unless you have to because your investors demand it. That's my rule of thumb. We won't get into the details of venture investment. I've got hours and hours on the YouTube channel and many slides that go through all of these issues in detail. For now, I just want you to know that you really need to understand what your investors want before you talk about structuring. Now I'd like to turn to some bigger issues that here. So when you do business in the US, and we do have quite a big contingent here from outside the US, so I want to pause on this. You're going to find that the US is really schizophrenic. We've got dual personalities. We have a policy of open competition and freedom of contract, right? That is throughout US law. You're allowed to make whatever contract you're allowed to make. And the government won't step in and rewrite, or a court won't step in and rewrite your agreements for you. You're all adults and you can make whatever deal you want. On the other hand, we also have strong policies of protection, consumer protection and employee protection. And those protections just expand and expand all the time. So you'll find laws that are a little, you might be scratching your head about because they seem to be at cross purposes. We'll get into a handful of them in a minute. But just keep that in mind. That's why that is, because we've got these two sometimes competing policies at play. Secondly, we've got a dual system, at least dual. There's a set of federal laws that we have to think about whenever you do business anywhere in the country. And also every state has its own set of laws. So we've got interstate commerce and intrastate commerce, and that comes into play as well. So just because you can, and I hear this a lot, people say, well, gee, I've complied with California law, I should be good. Well, not necessarily, or vice versa. You know, I've met the federal rules, so I'm good. No, California might also have a rule. Let me give you some specific examples. Securities laws is where this probably shows up the most, because the Securities and Exchange Commission its primary purpose is really investor protection. And a lot of people say, well, no, the SEC is there to, to help people trade, help companies sell their shares. No, that's not really their thing. Their thing is to protect the investors that are investing in your company. And a lot of people get that backwards and are surprised when they find out. They're a watchdog. And why you might get surprised is because there are some pretty permissive over the last 10 years exemptions from the securities laws that allow you to do sales of securities for federal purposes. On the other hand, there are investor protections and you have to comply. There are oftentimes filing requirements. There are definitely anti-fraud provisions always. There are oftentimes disclosure requirements. So just keep in mind, even though there are these permissive exemptions, you have to comply. And this is very, very serious. This is the kind of thing people go to jail for violating these laws, even inadvertently. So this is where you absolutely need a lawyer to help, because if you're selling stock or notes or debt or any securities. And if you don't believe me, you should go watch that documentary. I think the name of it is The Polka King. It's about Jan Levon, who got in trouble by selling promissory notes unregistered. And that brings us to the second part. This is a good illustration. There's a federal law of securities, and every state will have their own state laws. We call them blue sky laws. So even though there's a federal exemption from the securities laws, it does not require you to register or maybe even file. There may be a state requirement that you file a notice, or maybe even take other types of actions or clear other hurdles in terms of who your investors are. So you always have to check both of them. All right, consumer product safety, they set federal safety standards. EPA, we all know about pollution standards. I won't go through all of these. These are just a handful of the most active federal regulatory agencies. One down here I want to mention that's getting more active and is going to is the National Labor Relations Board. We have a new president for about the last 6 months now, 8 months, I guess. It's already August. And our new president has a much different view towards employment than our last administration did. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but Congress has not been going along with some of the employment initiatives, but you'll find that the executive branch has a lot of authority to enforce employment initiatives just through its labor department. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just want to call your attention to it. For those of you who are involved in internet-related activities, keep in mind there's a whole body of regulation around anything you do online, especially if you're here in California. California is one of the few states that has its own privacy law. So not only are there a handful of different privacy regimes at the federal level, depending on your business, health and medical, financial, etc., but California has a privacy act that, think of it like our own GDPR. Here in California, that has to be complied with. It's easy to fall into. It is sometimes counterintuitive, something we really need to pay attention to, but generally it's going to restrict what you tell people on your website if you're collecting personally identifiable data. You will almost always have to have privacy policies. You'll almost always have to have terms of service on your website if you're doing business in this country and especially in this state. So we talked a little bit about, I want to pause on employee for a minute, because again, in particular, I'd like to point out the differences between the law here and what you might expect if you're doing business overseas. So number one, just pay attention to tax, of course, and that's the structuring. Number two, pay attention to liability, and that's the structuring that we talked about. Number three, better pay attention to employee status, because the world is changing and the United States is changing and California has changed. And we've had a recent set of laws here that make it much more difficult to pay somebody as a contractor or as a service provider and not treat them as an employee. Why is that significant? Well, first of all, it increased your costs as an employer by about 30% because of payroll taxes, because of required benefits, because of workers' comp, because of all the things that have to happen. So it's something we really need to pay attention to. And backing up a slide, I'll show you, we've got this thing called the Private Attorneys General Act, where any employee can sue on behalf of all employees if an employer messes this up. So the takeaways are here, you need to be very careful about trying to treat anybody as a non-employee and not doing the withholding and not reporting and not paying benefits. And secondly, it's a very expensive mistake to make, a very, very expensive mistake to make. And I've seen many companies that have been totally destroyed because they messed this up. This one issue, it totally happens. It's particularly important for you gig economy companies out there. For those of you that have platforms where people are allowed to sell their services back and forth. So I'm mentioning this. This is not only a California issue for the future, because there is legislation pending in the Senate right now that would be the biggest legislation in many years in the employment world if it were to pass. And that legislation would increase this expansive definition of employee to cover the entire country, but would also make a lot of other changes in employment law, including the right to use arbitration, things like that. So it's an area that you should pay attention to. Enough about employees. Yeah, there's the federal action. There's actually been even a more recent bill since then in the Senate. I want to move on in the last time that we have to talk about the fourth thing you ought to think about is intellectual property protection. And again, we can't drill down too much on this other than to let you know that intellectual property, and what do we mean by that? We mean by your rights to use your trade secrets, your patents, your copyrights, and your trademarks, your fancy marks and logos. That's all local, right? It's all geographical. So even though you might have protection in your foreign country, your home country, that doesn't mean you have protection in the United States. Intellectual property is really local. Now, patents, they depend on filings and registrations with the federal government. And we have, again, plenty of materials in our slides and on our site if you want to drill down on this. But just be aware that I feel like you should patent often and early. Patent protection, a patent gives you the right, if you've got a secret or a process or an invention, gives you the right to keep other parties from using that. You can sue to infringe. A copyright is a right that protects works of authorship, a film, a script, a book, something like that. I don't deal that much with copyrights. It is relatively weak protection if you can get some other type of protection. So it's usually patent. Trademark is the one that people tend to not pay as much attention to as they probably should. A trademark is the right to protect a word, a symbol, or something like that. Logos or slogans. If you're going to do business here in the US, the first thing you should do is you should Google your name and your mark. Well, Google the name. I think Google has a way to Google images now, and make sure nobody else is using it, especially in your business. Second thing you should do is do what they call a knockout search with the Patent and Trademark Office and find out if anybody is using it or has registered it. And thirdly, you might want to think about a federal registration of that mark so that if anybody does have a claim, you know, they have an opportunity to make their claim or forever hold their peace so that you can secure your mark rights to the mark. It's super important because your mark is going to be very tied into the goodwill that you build overseas and in this country, and you want to make sure that you've got protection to it. Finally, this is probably your most valuable asset, your trade secrets. Most of the companies I deal with, of course, they've got patents, and that's the world sees their patents, so they patent it, and it's maybe easier to reverse engineer, so they have to patent to get that protection, but they also have trade secret around it. Processes, designs, systems, ways of doing it. It's just know-how that they've kept secret. It has to be value, it has to be secret, and here's the kicker, you have to take steps to keep it secret. So even though it may be your most valuable asset, it's also likely your most fragile asset. In other words, you can easily lose your trade secret protection. So if you've got some process, and it doesn't even have to be that much, it could be a customer list, it could be customer specifications, It could be just ways of doing things, but you need to keep it secret. How do you do that? And by the way, you need to take these efforts to keep it secret in order for the law to give you this status and give you this protection. How do we keep this secret? Well, number one, NDAs, right? You want to have good NDAs, non-disclosure agreements with everybody that sees it. Number two, you need to have good security so that it's not going to get hacked or easily accessed by anybody else. You probably want to have processes in place to make sure it doesn't get shared with other folks. Finally, data. So much of the world is data now. Data is so valuable. Data has become its own business over the last several years. Data can be a trade secret. Again, how do you keep stuff like that secret? How do you maintain your rights to it? Through good, solid contracts and good processes. We don't have time to get into contracts. I will tell you that doing business in the US, of course, you're going to want to have good, contracts. These are the different types of contracts you could use to do business here. In the slides, we go through the terms that you would like to think about in all of these contracts. Just, keep in mind, there's a lot to talk about here. We could do a whole hour on things to think about in commercial contracts. But what you'll find is the United States legal system really likes paper. Okay, we really like paper. It might be digital, but we like things in writing. We like things to be signed. We don't like handshake deals so much. So make sure that you've got good, solid contracts. With that, I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and open this up to questions because we are at the top of the hour. So let me stop the share. And if you have questions, why don't you go ahead and put them in, not into the chat box, go ahead and put them into the Q&A box, and maybe we can get to them. So let's see what we've got here. Let's see here. Yeah, and the question should be technical. Okay, here's one. What's your point of view on a startup migration out of California into places like Miami, Austin, New York, Boulder, really? I love Boulder. I didn't know there was a migration there. It's in Colorado because of the increase in living costs. Yeah, thank you for that. Definitely the world has changed. And definitely the last year and a half, probably due to our lockdowns and our extremely restrictive laws and talk of tax increases. We're at 13.3% now. The legislature wants it to raise it to the high 16%. Plus there's talk of a wealth tax. A lot of companies have left and a lot of individuals have left. And I've spent a lot of my time, in fact, counseling companies and individuals on how to leave California in order to minimize taxes and how to do that legally and correctly. So there's no doubt that there has been an exodus out of this state. Similarly, what we found is that a lot of these other areas have really grown, Austin and Miami in particular. I think the stats show that those are probably two of the biggest recipients of California's policies. So here's my take on that. I've seen this movie before. I've seen people come and go. I've seen us have downtimes when people left. This one is probably more man-made than the past times. But I've also seen people return here to Silicon Valley. Remember what I said, $6 or $7 trillion in market cap is here. That's not going anywhere, right? The market is here. The educational institutions are here. The talent is here. This is the rainforest. So while all these other places are going to do great, I still think geographically this is a good place to be, because like when I say rainforest, what I mean, a friend of mine wrote a book called The Rainforest about Silicon Valley. And what I mean is that you can kind of find anybody that you need. You can find any service you want. Those people are here in almost anything. So I don't think that's going to change. Now, just last week, Mark Andreessen from the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz said in an interview that he thought Silicon Valley has now fundamentally changed. And it's become much less of a geographic thing, and I guess more of an idea, I guess is what he was talking about, because people are remote all over the country now, even though they're working for Silicon Valley companies. And I think that's probably true. There's probably a lot of truth in that. A lot of people have left. A lot of people are living in other places, but the base is probably still here. And California is never going to be the cheapest place to do business. It's never going to have a low tax rate, no matter what. It's just too late for that. It's never going to have a hands-off regulatory environment. It's going to be a highly regulated place. It leads the nation in some of these ideas. AB 5, this new employment law that's, that imposes employment status on gig workers, whether they want it or not, that's a California idea, or at least, partially. I know there's another state that has the same rule. But that is primarily a California idea. We codified that idea here in California. It wasn't just some activist court, so although that's how it started, it became codified and now it may go nationwide. So that stuff like that is not going to change. Okay, thank you for the question. Next question. What considerations should you have in terms of legal and tax regulation if you establish your headquarters in California, but your tech company has online revenue nationwide? Well, yeah, online revenue. Kind of depends on the revenue, but I'm glad you asked, because almost every company I see now and I might put my slides back up in a minute on this, because almost every company I see is having problems with state taxation. Because just to give you a little bit of history, so sit back and give you some history. In the mid 80s, there was a company that was doing business, and back then people did business in other states. They'd send a big catalog, a big paper catalog, and they sent their big paper catalogs to my home state of North Dakota, and I actually happened to be practicing law there at the time. And people look at the catalog, and then they'd fill out a form, and they'd put it in the U.S. post office and send a paper mail to this company in California, and they'd buy their product. And the California tax commissioner said, well, that's not very fair that you're not paying sales tax because you're out in California. You should be paying North Dakota sales tax. So there's a big case, went to the Supreme Court. It's kind of a mixed review, but at least we got some standards on how California companies could not get taxed in other states for sales tax, cannot have to pay sales tax if they don't have any physical presence there. And that was the standard, physical presence. Well, a few years ago, South Dakota, we call it the weaker sister, there was a company called Wayfair doing business in South Dakota. Now, we're 30 years later, it's not using big paper catalogs anymore. It's doing its business online. People are going online and buying stuff from Wayfair. But they're selling it to South Dakota residents. So the South Dakota tax commissioner says, well, that's not very fair. If you're a merchant here in South Dakota, you got to collect sales tax, but if you're sitting out in California and sell online, you don't. So they impose a sales tax collection obligation on that out-of-state company. That went to the Supreme Court. This time the Supreme Court took a little different approach. And they allowed this thing called economic nexus. What that means is if you have enough sales of tangible personal property into a state, that creates sales tax nexus, and that state can require you to collect sales tax. Now, if you're selling through somebody like Amazon, they've already got a system in place that will help you with this. But a lot of companies will want to sell direct, and you need to be careful about that because you can get in a lot of trouble by not collecting sales tax. What do I mean? Why can you get in trouble? Let me give you a real example for one of my clients. New York State, they have about a 4% margin on their sales, pretty thin margin. They don't have any people in New York. They don't have an office there, but they hosted a couple of trade shows there in order to promote the product. State of New York said, you know what? That's enough of a presence. Plus you're selling a lot of products into our state. You owe us 8%. Now, had they been in the system, they could have passed that 8% on to their customers and say, look, you got to pay us the purchase price plus sales tax of 8%. And they would be out of pocket zero, just the hassle of doing it. And now that they're not in the system and the state is going back, what are they going to do? Go back to their customers from 3 years ago and say, look, we forgot to charge you sales tax. Would you mind paying? No, they're going to have to pay that. And now their 4% margin becomes a negative 4% margin on all those sales. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal. So we have to be careful about that. And that's the number one consideration when you have online revenue nationwide, is to make sure you do a nexus study and make sure that you're not caught in those tax nets. And then the other type, as long as I'm on this, is income tax. If you do have enough presence in a state, you'll also have to file income taxes. And again, states like California, we have a single sales factor here now. So you could end up paying income tax in California without really having much of anything else here but sales. Okay, next question. Is it possible to get investments from US-based investors before incorporating in the US? What an excellent question. If you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, I'd have said not a chance, especially if your investors are here in Silicon Valley. Remember those statistics I put up on the board earlier on, right? Tremendous amount of money here, tremendous amount of investment here, but there's a lot of companies here. Pretty much everybody's here, a lot of startups, and investors 5 years ago did not have to go very far at all to invest in company. They wouldn't even go to Stockton, which was 50 miles away to invest in a company. They don't want to drive to board meetings. They don't want to sit on airplanes. Well, then COVID came along and people got used to Zoom and other types of online services. And the investment community has gotten much more comfortable with investing outside of their area. And I've known VCs to make investments in companies where they have never met the founders. That was unheard of just 2 years ago, but that happens now. So the answer is maybe. It's much more likely now than it was before. It also depends on the fund. There are some funds that they don't care. They're worldwide and they don't care where you're incorporated. However, the general rule, and generalizations are risky, I know, the general rule is still VCs prefer Delaware corporations. So my experience is, especially here in Silicon Valley, where there's lots and lots of opportunities, that's what they're going to want you to do. Okay, we should spend a little more time on the huge culture shock of US culture business approaches. In 20 years as an entrepreneur with ties to Europe and Asia, one of the biggest issues to success is not legal frameworks, but culture clashes between US employees and foreign founders. And some of the places you were speaking about, Texas and Florida, don't have an open mind about foreigners. Gabor, you've come to this country from someplace else, and you've talked a little bit about the cultural issues. Is this something that you can speak to a little bit for us?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and there is a lot of truth in it. If you are from another country, you have different cultures, different values, especially if you are more exotic countries like Asia or I don't know. Mostly I would say Asia has interesting and different values from the Western society, and my experience is that the acceptance is largely depends on the geographical region. Like here in California, people are more open, the society is more diverse, like also New York, the big hubs where foreign immigrants and foreign entrepreneurs are coming in a large number. The society became more open to accept different values and different cultural customs. But truth to be told, if you are going to any other country in the world, you have to face the challenges that comes from a different culture, because you just need to adapt to a new society. And whenever you go, you are going to be an immigrant, and they will notice it. You have an accent, you are acting different way in certain situation, even after living 10 years in the country. But I wouldn't say it's wrong. It's not wrong because an immigrant and other people or people from another country bring different perspectives, different values, and especially nowadays, companies value that. There are, for example, this what they call diversity funds, and there were a lot of studies about diversity, and many studies concluded that in a diverse community, you can solve more problems more efficiently, and that's why many big companies, especially here in Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook, large firms, many times welcome foreign people, and they like to work with immigrants. So I think we can see changes on this area too, and you don't have to be ashamed of your values where you are from, because you can contribute to this country.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think what I might do here is, there's a question about, can an immigrant on an H-1B visa start a company in the USA? Just to be clear, I'm not an immigration lawyer, but that's commonly done. I do enough of this to know that a lot of folks will start companies here, regardless of their immigration status, as long as they're not employed here in the U.S. or engaged in gainful employment. Okay, here's a question. So a foreign company incorporating in the U.S. does not insure an immigrant visa, so the promoters might have to continue working from a foreign land. How is that accepted with U.S. markets and clients? Yeah, that's pretty common. That we'll have somebody, I'll see that somebody will come here, they'll start a U.S. company, and they'll come here on a business visa, and at some point they'll have to leave. And hopefully by the time they do, they've got enough of a presence here with their company that even though they're remote, their company can still continue on. So, by the way, can you let me know if you can see my screen? My video? Somebody chat me. Okay, here's what I'm going, no. Okay, that's what I was afraid of. Put this back on gallery view. There we go. Okay, you know what I think I might do here is go on back to the slides for a minute, because there were a couple of things I wanted to share that are worth talking about. When you do come to do business here in a country, you should see my commercial contract screen. That's where we left off. When you do come to do business here, once you set up the company, kind of the next thing you're going to do is figure out your strategy, your IP strategy, your market strategy, we'll call it, go to market. And that'll require a lot of paper. It's going to require you to determine how you're going to enter this market. Here's a handful of ways that foreign companies can actually access the market. So just to basically appoint a sales agent here, that's the simplest. You're not in the US, you're outside the US, you've engaged an agent in the US to actually conduct your sales activities. And oftentimes, in fact, most of the time, the way I see this work is a non-US company will just want to enter this market for sales and marketing. So in order to do that, they'll appoint somebody here that will only do sales and marketing, no development. That comes later. But this is a relatively expensive place to do that sort of development, so that's probably not going to happen immediately. So that's a very simple agreement. Properly structured, we can avoid any tax consequences to the non-US entity on its US sales other than sales tax, as we talked about, but we can minimize or avoid income tax consequences. Also, there are distributor agreements. You might appoint distributors, or reseller agreements, where the reseller has the right to take their product, put it into theirs and resell it. License agreements, where you simply sit offshore and collect royalties from a U.S. company or a U.S. Party that's going to take your intellectual property and incorporate it into their product. Now, there's a big difference between the sales agreement. All you're really paying the agent is compensation, right? The distributor and reseller agreements, you're basically selling a product, and we can make that a non-U.S. source sale so we can minimize taxes. A license agreement will have a royalty, and unless you're in a country with which the U.S. has an income tax treaty, there's likely to be a withholding tax on that royalty. The default is 30%. It's a big number. So we oftentimes will have to, carefully try to transform that license agreement into some other type of agreement. Rather than license IP, we would rather just sell licensed products, or maybe pay somebody a service fee for selling our licensed products. It's subtle, but it is extremely significant. And trust me, all the big companies know about this. The next stage, you might decide that you want to do a joint venture. And that means that you'll get together with your counterparty and usually just create a separate entity that's a partnership or strategic alliance, where each party brings something to the table. Something, you might bring the IP and they might bring the money. So joint venture tends to be a much more extensive process than just a simple agreement. It's usually a group of agreements that requires a separate business entity that's actually approaching this market. It's not a bad way as a strategy matter to think about coming into the US. Because if you think about it, you've got a great product, but you're going into an unknown market, and you can find a partner here that knows the market, that knows the laws, that knows the systems, and that might even have some cash to invest, that can provide facilities, that maybe can do your manufacturing. So joint ventures, inbound joint ventures are very common. And a partnership and strategic alliance is just another form of joint venture. It's one step up. We actually form a company with a partner. So instead of being a 100% owned subsidiary, it's partially owned by you and partially owned by someone here in the US. Okay, let's go on to talk a little bit more. If we do commercial contracts, some of the terms that we want to think about when you put that contract together. Territory, if you're giving someone a right to sell your product, where do they have that right? Is it exclusive? In other words, do they, and that works both ways, do they have the exclusive right to sell your product in that territory? And by the way, the flip side is, are they going to compete with you and sell competing products? Things to think about in your contracts. How are they going to be paid? What are they going to be paid? Who owns the IP that comes out of that contract? Important issue to think about. Indemnity. This is really significant. The indemnity clause. And I want to tell you that I had a client many years ago that, and usually the indemnity clause is going to be a limitation of indemnity. In other words, it'll say if something goes wrong with this product and we get sued, we, the US party, get sued, you, the foreign party, are going to indemnify us and represent us and reimburse us for any costs that we have. That's a basic indemnity clause. Usually an indemnity clause will have all sorts of limitations around it, where the party's liability under the indemnity clause is going to be limited in time and in amount. So it comes up in a million different ways, but it really does have to be spelled out into the contract. Otherwise, parties might be taking on unlimited liabilities. Now, as I was saying, I had it happen many years ago going the other way, where the US company sold its product to a non-US company. It was a very large non-US company, in fact, one of the biggest companies in the world, but they had a very simple agreement, and there was no limits on the indemnity that they were required to provide. So what happened, it turned out that once their little product got into the big company's product, infringement claims came out of the woodwork. Turned out they had been infringing on somebody else's patent. And that meant that the big company was not going to get the benefit of the bargain. They weren't going to be able to manufacture their products using my client's products. So they made a claim against my client, the manufacturer and seller of this infringing product. And it wasn't just a claim for what it cost him, it was a claim for all the profits that they could have gotten down the road. The amount of the claim was, I'm not kidding, it was over $1 billion. And of course, our next step was to the bankruptcy court. So it's really important in these contracts that we spell out who bears the risks for these things happening and what the potential liability can be. But by the way, my client did all this without my counsel, in case you're wondering. I didn't get involved until after the contract was signed, because I never in a million years would let somebody agree to that. I wouldn't even want to be a party to that kind of contract. Some of the agreement terms, for those of you shipping product, you think about shipping terms, payment terms, where does the risk of loss pass? Where does title pass? Who's going to cover the insurance? A most favored nation clause, that means that if you end up making a better deal with somebody else, you'll give the benefit of that deal to the original counterparty. Price protection, if your price goes down, the person buying from you gets the benefit of that price protection. Indemnities, warranties we talked about. And who owns the trademarks, and what can your distributor here in the US do with the marks? Let me take a look here. So while you're thinking up some good questions, I'm going to go on to the next topic here, which is investors, because a lot of you I know are moving here to receive investment. So let me just say a few words about that, and maybe we can close on investment, unless there are questions. And if you do have questions, put it in the Q&A box, not the chat box. So a lot of companies come here to get venture capital investment. That's maybe one of the biggest reasons that I see companies move here to the Valley, because despite what you've heard, it's still focused right here. Now, as we talked about in the Q&A, US investors they've loosened up a little, and they are more willing to invest in foreign startups than they used to be. But nevertheless, most likely they're going to want you to incorporate in Delaware. We've talked all about that. Then what? Then what are you going to do? Then what do you sell to them? And these are the typical instruments that we would see. Convertible notes, that's just a promissory note that converts to stock. The SAFE is like convertible equity. That is really no promise to repay. It's just the investor gives you, the company, the money today, and you give them stock down the road when your company does a priced round or preferred stock financing. Series seed, that's stock, that's actual ownership of the company. And all of these three, the convertible notes and safes, are usually what we call pre-seed. It's what happens very early when you talk to angels. The other instruments are usually a little later stage, series seed, and then preferred stock. That's actual ownership in your company, but it's stock ownership, and it usually has a preference so that the investor gets their money back first when you sell the company. That's why preferred stock costs more than common stock. We do a whole hour on preferred stock terms because there are lots and lots of strings that come along with it. And you won't do a preferred stock round until you're relatively further down, you're quite a bit further down the road. The new kid on the block, royalty financing, that's a new one. That's an interesting one. It's well, not so new, but it's new in the sense that it's gaining speed. Royalty financing, shared appreciation, and this is really the idea that you're selling off a revenue stream. So instead of selling somebody a piece of your company, you'd be selling the investor a right to maybe X% of revenue from a certain product or something like that for a period of time. It's gaining traction. I've been seeing more and more of these deals, and they're getting very sophisticated and complicated. Lots of tax issues, lots of regulatory issues, but they are getting done, and I've been doing them myself. Just keep in mind that VCs will look at these and view this as debt. And debt's usually a bad thing because it gets paid before the venture capitalist does. So just keep that in mind when you do this. All right. Tokens, Well, I haven't seen many ICOs lately, but I have seen a lot of companies issuing tokens. Usually we do that outside the US. We do a whole hour on this as well, although that law is changing quickly. And then alternative investments, private equity, etc. So let me go back. So we got a question here in the Q&A about equity compensation for services provided, milestones and deliverables. Most startup companies will hire advisors. And if you're a non-US company coming to do business in the US, it's particularly important to have advisors here to help you understand the environment. But advisors, keep in mind, are there for a very specific purpose. Advisors are there to advise you on their area of expertise. So your advisors probably tend to have, they get paid in equity, but that equity vests not generally based on time or only time, but also based on milestones and performance metrics. So for example, if the advisor is there to help you get sales leads, well, they might vest once they've gotten you X number of leads or closed Y number of sales. It might be vesting tied to something like that. These are fact specific. What you don't want to have is an agreement with an advisor that is simply time-based, unless that advisor is going to be regularly talking to you, so because advisors typically don't punch a clock. So time vesting is less useful for them than it is for employees. So usually it's milestone vesting, and it's tied very specifically to what it is you want them to do for you. Okay, well, on that note, again, feel free to post in the chat your LinkedIn profile, who you are, where you're from, who you want to meet, what you sell, all of that stuff. I've already given you my YouTube channel. Make sure you sign up to my YouTube channel and subscribe, because we have tons of content like this. Find me on LinkedIn. Be happy to link with you. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to go ahead and conclude the webinar, and we will see you all next time.